In 1971, the United States committed what should have been financial suicide. For decades, the dollar had been tied to gold. Every paper note represented something tangible, something ancient, something universally trusted. Gold was not merely metal, it was psychological certainty. Civilizations rose and fell chasing it. Kings built empires around it. Entire wars were fought for it. And then, almost overnight, America severed the connection. President Richard Nixon stepped in front of television cameras and announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The world's reserve currency was suddenly backed by nothing physical at all. No metal, no hard asset. Only belief, historically. This is the exact moment the American financial empire should have collapsed, because throughout history, every empire that detached money from tangible value eventually suffered the same fate. Rome diluted its silver coins until trust evaporated. Spain flooded Europe with treasure from the New World and triggered devastating inflation. Britain, once the center of global finance, slowly lost monetary dominance after debt and imperial overstretch consumed its power. History seemed to follow a law as old as civilization itself. When money becomes disconnected from reality, collapse follows, except this time, something impossible happened. America became even more powerful after abandoning gold. And that contradiction is the key to understanding the modern world. At this very moment, giant oil tankers move silently through the darkness of the Persian Gulf, deep beneath Manhattan. Traders stare at glowing screens capable of moving billions of dollars within seconds. In Washington, central bankers speak in carefully controlled language while global markets hang on every sentence. Across Europe and Asia, governments accumulate mountains of debt larger than anything imaginable in previous centuries. The system appears stable, but beneath the surface, invisible currents are constantly moving. Oil, wars, sanctions, inflation, currency crises, military alliances at first glance. These events look disconnected, separate headlines from separate parts of the world. But beneath modern geopolitics exists a hidden architecture linking all of them together. Like circuitry beneath a giant machine. The petrodollar. Most people hear the term and imagine something technical, something boring. A niche economic arrangement discussed by bankers and analysts. But the petrodollar is not merely economics. It is power disguised as finance. Because for decades, nearly every country on Earth needed one thing to survive: industrial civilization: oil, and to buy oil. They needed US dollars. Think carefully about how strange that really is. A factory in China, an airline in Germany, a shipping company in India, a military base in Japan. Different governments, different cultures, different political systems, yet all forced into the same monetary bloodstream simply to access energy. The dollar stopped being ordinary currency. It became a global survival mechanism. It became oxygen. And once a currency reaches that level of importance, geopolitics transforms into something much darker than most people realize. Wars stop being only about ideology. Power stops being measured only by armies. Influence begins flowing through invisible financial networks that ordinary people never see. Suddenly, strange patterns begin appearing throughout modern history. In the early 2000s, Saddam Hussein discussed selling Iraqi oil in euros instead of dollars. Years later, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed the idea of a gold-backed African currency capable of bypassing Western financial dominance. Russia and China slowly began building alternative payment systems outside American control. Every challenge to the structure seemed to trigger geopolitical earthquakes. Sanctions. Isolation. Instability. Conflict. Now maybe these events were unrelated. Maybe they were coincidence. But history becomes unsettling when coincidences start repeating themselves. Because the petrodollar was never simply about oil pricing, it became the hidden operating system of global civilization. A financial architecture so deeply embedded into the modern world that most people live entirely inside it without realizing it exists. And once you begin seeing the system, you cannot unsee it. Why can America print enormous amounts of debt while other countries collapse under far smaller burdens? Why do financial sanctions sometimes cripple nations faster than military invasions? Why does instability in distant oil-producing regions send shockwaves through stock markets thousands of miles away? Why do global markets panic whenever the U.S. Federal Reserve changes interest rates? The answers do not begin with politics. They begin with energy. Because civilization itself runs on energy. Every illuminated skyline, every cargo ship crossing oceans, every airplane in the sky, every military machine, every factory producing modern life, all of it depends on continuous energy flow. And for half a century, the bloodstream of global energy flowed through the dollar. That gave America something no empire in history had ever truly possessed before: the ability to export paper and receive real goods, labor, resources, and wealth in return. Think about how extraordinary that is. Most nations must produce tangible value before they can consume wealth. They manufacture products, extract resources, build industries, earn foreign currency. But reserve currency dominance altered the rules entirely. America discovered a way to make the world need its currency first. The result was a system where countries opposing American power still depended on dollars daily. Rivals financed U.S. debt by purchasing treasury bonds. Oil exporters recycled profits back into American financial markets. Entire economies became structurally tied to the stability of the dollar system. It was no longer merely economics, it was gravity. A self-reinforcing global dependency loop. And like all systems built on dependency, it created both enormous strength and hidden fragility. Because the deeper the world became connected to the dollar, the more terrifying the consequences of instability became. Modern civilization slowly transformed into a giant machine powered not only by oil, but by confidence itself. Confidence that the dollar would remain dominant. Confidence that energy markets would remain stable. Confidence that America could sustain endless debt without catastrophic consequences. Confidence that the system would continue functioning tomorrow exactly as it functions today. But history contains a warning most civilizations ignore while they are still powerful. Systems built on confidence often appear immortal right before they begin to fracture. And perhaps the strangest part of all is this: most people still believe geopolitics is primarily about democracy, borders, elections, or military conflict. But what if those are only the visible surface? What if beneath modern history exists a deeper struggle, one centered not on territory, but on controlling the financial bloodstream of civilization itself? Because once you understand the petrodollar, the modern world begins looking less like a collection of random global events, and more like a giant interconnected system desperately trying to preserve belief in one currency at the center of it all. To understand how that system was built, we have to go back to the ashes of World War II, where the foundations of the modern financial empire were first created when World War II finally ended. The world looked like it had survived the collapse of civilization itself. Entire cities across Europe had been reduced to ruins. Factories were destroyed. Railways were shattered. Economies that once dominated the world were bankrupt and exhausted. Britain, the empire that had controlled global trade routes for centuries, emerged from the war financially drained. France was politically unstable. Germany was physically devastated. Across Asia, entire populations struggled to rebuild from destruction. But while much of the world burned through its wealth and infrastructure, the United States grew stronger. American factories had expanded massively during wartime production. Industrial output surged. The U.S. mainland remained untouched by bombing campaigns. And most importantly, America possessed something the rest of the world desperately needed. Gold. By the mid-1940s, the United States controlled the majority of the planet's gold reserves. Fort Knox became more than a vault. It became the symbolic center of global trust. This gave Washington extraordinary leverage in shaping the post-war order. In 1944, before the war had even officially ended, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a quiet town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. On the surface, the conference was about rebuilding the global economy. But beneath the diplomacy, something much larger was happening. A new financial empire was being designed. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a revolutionary system. Instead of every currency floating chaotically against one another, global currencies would be tied to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself would be directly convertible into gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. The message to the world was clear. The dollar was as good as gold. And because America possessed the industrial power, military influence, and gold reserves to support that promise, the world accepted the arrangement. For a while, the system worked beautifully. Global trade expanded rapidly. Europe rebuilt itself. Japan industrialized at astonishing speed. International commerce flourished because countries trusted the stability of the dollar-based order. America became the financial heart of the modern world, but hidden inside. Bretton Woods was a contradiction, so dangerous that it would eventually threaten the entire system. The world needed dollars to facilitate trade, but the only way to supply the world with enough dollars was for America to continuously print and export them outward. This created what economists later called the tri-fine dilemma. It's a paradox at the center of reserve currencies. If America failed to provide enough dollars, global trade would slow down. But if America supplied too many dollars, confidence in the currency would eventually collapse because the amount of paper circulating would exceed the gold backing it. The system required trust to survive, and trust is fragile. By the 1960s, cracks were beginning to spread beneath the surface. The United States was spending enormous amounts of money fighting the Vietnam War while simultaneously funding expensive domestic programs at home. Dollars flooded the global economy faster than ever before. Foreign governments began quietly asking dangerous questions. Did America actually possess enough gold to back all the dollars now circulating around the world? Or was the system becoming an illusion sustained purely by confidence? France became one of the loudest critics. President Charles de Gaulle openly accused America of abusing what he called its exorbitant privilege. France argued that the United States could effectively print paper in exchange for real goods and resources from the rest of the world. And then France did something that terrified Washington. Instead of simply holding dollars, French officials began demanding physical gold in exchange. Ships reportedly crossed the Atlantic, carrying stacks of dollars to America and returning with gold bars. Other nations started paying attention because once confidence weakens inside a monetary system, fear spreads faster than facts. Governments realized something deeply unsettling. America had printed far more dollars than it could realistically redeem in gold. The numbers, no longer matched reality. The world stood at the edge of a financial panic, and then came August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced what became known as the Nixon shock. The United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. Temporary. That word would quietly reshape the future of global civilization because the suspension never ended. The gold window closed forever, and suddenly, the entire global economy entered completely uncharted territory. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was backed not by tangible assets, but by faith alone historically. This should have destroyed the dollar. Every major empire that detached money from real value eventually faced inflation, stability, or collapse. The laws of history seemed clear. But instead of collapsing, America adapted in a way almost nobody fully understood at the time. Behind closed doors during the 1970s, U.S. officials began negotiating one of the most important geopolitical arrangements in modern history. The agreement centered around Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia possessed enormous oil reserves and immense strategic importance. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 had already demonstrated how vulnerable industrial nations were to disruptions in energy supply. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was power. America offered the Saudi kingdom military protection, weapons, security guarantees, and geopolitical support. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and invest surplus oil revenues back into American financial markets. Soon, other major OPEC nations followed the same structure, and just like that, the petrodollar system was born. The implications were staggering. Oil was the foundation of industrial civilization. Transportation depended on it. Agriculture relied on it. Factories consumed it. Militaries required it. Every modern economy needed continuous access to energy, which meant every nation suddenly needed dollars, not because they loved America, not because they trusted America morally, but because they needed oil to survive. This transformed the dollar into something even more powerful than gold-backed. Currency gold sits silently in vaults. Oil moves civilization itself. America had tied its currency to the most strategically important resource on Earth, and in doing so, it achieved something unprecedented in human history. It created artificial global demand for its currency through necessity. The paradox was extraordinary. Losing gold should have weakened the dollar instead. It expanded American influence across the planet. Wars, alliances, military bases, trade routes, debt markets, and geopolitical strategy slowly reorganized themselves around one central reality. The dollar had become inseparable from global energy, and once energy became linked to currency, modern geopolitics transformed into something far more complex than most people ever realized, because the petrodollar system did not simply preserve American power after 1971. It unlocked an entirely new kind of empire. The petrodollar system did not operate like a traditional empire. There were no colonial governors standing on foreign soil, no flags planted across conquered territory, no official declaration announcing that the world economy had quietly reorganized itself around American currency. That is what made the system so powerful. It was largely invisible. Most people experienced its effects every day without ever seeing the machinery underneath to understand how it worked. Imagine the global economy as a giant circulatory system. Oil is the blood, and the dollar became the heart pumping through it. Every industrial nation on Earth needed energy to survive. Factories needed fuel. Cargo ships needed diesel. Airlines needed jet fuel. Militaries consumed enormous quantities of oil every single day. Without energy, modern civilization would stop functioning within weeks. But there was one crucial condition attached to that energy system. Oil was priced primarily in U.S. dollars. This meant countries first needed dollars before they could access the fuel powering their economies. And that simple mechanism created one of the greatest financial feedback loops in history. A country exporting goods to the world accumulated dollars. A country borrowing money often borrowed in dollars. Central banks stored dollar reserves because energy imports depended on them. International trade increasingly flowed through dollar-based systems. Then something even more. Important happened. Those dollars often returned back into the United States. Oil-producing nations accumulated enormous profits from global energy sales. But instead of simply holding piles of physical cash, they reinvested those dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds, Wall Street banks, American real estate, and financial assets. The money completed a circle. The world needed dollars for oil. The world earned dollars through trade. Then the world reinvested those dollars back into America. This process became known as petrodollar recycling, and it changed the rules of global power completely, because most nations throughout history faced hard limits. If they borrowed too much money, inflation exploded. Investors panicked. Currencies collapsed. Debt crises emerged. Governments were forced into austerity or default. But the United States operated differently. America could run enormous deficits because global demand for dollars remained permanently high. The rest of the world continuously absorbed U.S. debt. As part of maintaining the global financial system itself, think about how extraordinary that really is. Imagine a casino where every player must first exchange their money for casino chips before entering the building. Now imagine that. Same casino possesses the ability to print unlimited chips whenever necessary. That is the asymmetry of reserve currency dominance. America exported dollars. The world exported real goods, labor, energy, and resources in return. And because the global economy depended on dollar liquidity, the system kept reinforcing itself. But the deeper truth of the petrodollar system was psychological. It was not enforced solely through military strength. It survived through belief. Markets function on confidence. Currencies function on trust. Financial systems are ultimately mass, psychological structures built on collective agreement as long as nations believed everyone else would continue using dollars. The system remained stable. This created a strange paradox at the center of modern finance. The dollar appeared stable precisely because everyone feared instability. Countries distrusted American dominance. Yet abandoning the system seemed even more dangerous, and that dependency gave Washington extraordinary geopolitical leverage, because once the global economy flows through your currency infrastructure, financial systems become weapons. In previous centuries, empires used navies to blockade enemies. Modern powers could now isolate countries financially instead. A nation disconnected from dollar-clearing systems suddenly struggled to trade internationally. Access to global liquidity vanished. Foreign reserves became vulnerable. Investment disappeared. Banking systems destabilized. Money itself became geopolitical territory. This transformation became increasingly visible during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Sanctions evolved into instruments capable of crippling economies without firing missiles. Iran faced enormous pressure through restrictions targeting its access to dollar systems. Russian banks experienced isolation after geopolitical conflicts intensified. Entire nations discovered that modern sovereignty had invisible limitations, because participation in global trade increasingly required access to financial networks dominated by the United States and its allies. The SWIFT messaging system became one of the clearest examples. On the surface, SWIFT looked technical and neutral, simply infrastructure helping banks communicate internationally. But when nations were excluded from it, the consequences could be devastating. Trade slowed, transactions froze, financial panic spread. The world realized something unsettling. The infrastructure of globalization was not politically neutral. It carried power within it, and suddenly, geopolitics no longer looked like simple competition between countries. It looked like competition inside a financial operating system controlled largely by one dominant currency. But hidden beneath the strength of the system was an uncomfortable will-to-willy, well, Pawnee way, Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. Willy Will Rill, Willy Will Willy, and Livy Willy Will, long-lasting color. Ellie Willy Willing Millie Currency. Boo Willy Willy, but Willy Willy Willy, but Willy Willy sees. Willy 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 6, Willy Willy, Elwie Willy Willy, Billy Willy Will I seed. With Sev, with Con Melip. But Billy Will Lee I Bell I you can dub. It's ill we lily wick Elia is it to sis it to commisid suka I slis it sick at it but I'd sit says it get done with get the tacola that's Contradiction America appeared enormously wealthy, yet its debt expanded to staggering levels. The dollar appeared stable, yet it was backed largely by confidence. Rather than hard assets, countries criticized U.S. monetary influence, yet they continued depending on it daily. The system created a giant web of mutual dependency nobody fully controlled anymore. China became one of the clearest examples of this. Paradox: as America outsourced manufacturing overseas, China transformed into the factory of the world. Chinese exports generated massive amounts of dollars. Then China used those dollars to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds. Helping finance American debt and consumption, two rivals became economically intertwined. America depended on Chinese manufacturing. China depended on American consumers and dollar stability. The global economy increasingly resembled a machine whose individual parts distrusted one another, yet could not easily disconnect without causing catastrophe. And the deeper the system expanded, the more abstract wealth itself became. Financial markets exploded in size. Derivatives multiplied into the trillions. Debt expanded globally. Asset prices surged. Economies became increasingly financialized rather than industrial. The petrodollar system did not merely shape trade, it shaped human behavior. Governments adjusted policies around market reactions. Central banks became guardians of liquidity. Entire societies grew psychologically dependent on cheap debt and financial expansion. But systems built on confidence contain hidden fragility, because confidence behaves like trust inside a crowded theater. It feels permanent, until panic suddenly spreads, and slowly, beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Countries started asking dangerous questions. What happens if oil is no longer traded primarily in dollars? What happens if rival financial systems emerge? What happens if technological shifts reduce global energy dependency? Most importantly, what happens when nations begin realizing that the system stabilizing the world may also be quietly controlling it? Because once countries started searching for alternatives to dollar dominance, geopolitics entered a far more unstable era, and the next phase of the story would reveal just how interconnected and fragile the modern world had truly become. Once you understand the petrodollar system, global geopolitics stops looking random. The world begins resembling a giant web of invisible financial pressure points, where energy, currency, trade, and military power are all connected beneath the surface. Suddenly, distant conflicts no longer appear distant. A war in the Middle East affects inflation in Europe. Oil production cuts ripple through Asian manufacturing. Decisions made inside the U.S. Federal Reserve influence housing markets thousands of miles away. A sanction placed on one nation quietly raises food and fuel prices for millions of ordinary people across the globe. Everything is connected, because modern civilization was built on an extraordinary arrangement. Energy flowed through oil. Oil flowed through dollars, and dollars flowed through America. This transformed oil-rich regions into something far more important than geography. The Middle East became the center of a global economic nervous system. Control of shipping lanes, pipelines, And energy stability became inseparable from financial stability itself. Military bases expanded across strategic regions. Naval fleets protected maritime trade routes. Alliances formed not only around ideology, but around securing the continuous flow of energy required to sustain industrial civilization. And beneath all of it sat the dollar, invisible, patent, necessary, the deeper the world. Globalized. The more nations became trapped inside the same financial machine. Europe depended on imported energy. Asia depended on export-driven manufacturing. Oil producers depended on stable dollar markets. America depended on foreign demand for its debt. Even rivals became economically chained together. China became the clearest example of this paradox. For decades, America outsourced manufacturing overseas while China became the factory of the modern world. Chinese companies exported enormous quantities of goods to American consumers, accumulating trillions of dollars in return. Then China recycled many of those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds. The result was almost surreal. America consumed. China produced. China financed American debt, and both sides became dependent on the continuation of the same system they increasingly distrusted. The global economy no longer resembled independent nations competing normally. It resembled a giant machine, whose moving parts could not stop without damaging each other. And yet, beneath the appearance of stability, pressure was building, because no civilization remains comfortable with dependency forever. Gradually, countries began exploring ways to reduce reliance on the dollar system. Russia and China increased trade in local currencies. Central banks around the world started buying gold at record levels. Discussions around alternative payment systems intensified. BRICS nations explored frameworks capable of bypassing traditional Western financial infrastructure. At first, these changes looked minor, technical, almost invisible. But history often changes quietly before it changes suddenly. The unsettling reality was this: many countries feared dollar dominance, yet escaping it seemed incredibly dangerous, because the dollar remained dominant partly for the same reason empires remain powerful. Not merely because people trust them completely, but because no equally trusted alternative exists. The euro faced structural political weaknesses. China's financial system remained tightly controlled. Gold was difficult to scale for modern trade. Digital currencies introduced uncertainty and surveillance risks, so despite resentment toward American monetary influence, the world continued orbiting around the same system, a system everyone complained about, yet secretly protected. That is the paradox of global interconnection. Nations compete with one another while simultaneously depending on one another for survival. Enemies share financial infrastructure. Rivals hold each other's debt. The global economy became less like a battlefield and more like a giant spiderweb, vibrating with tension. And webs become fragile when pressure spreads unevenly, because history contains a warning repeated across centuries. Systems built on confidence often appear eternal right before they begin to fracture. And slowly, quietly, the first cracks were already beginning to form beneath the surface of the modern financial order.